Okay, we're going to continue with our social science resource guide. This time we're on page 22, and we're talking about the early Cold War in Asia. We just finished talking about the early Cold War in Europe. Important concept to keep in mind through all of this is this idea of decolonization and independence that happens after World War II finishes. So these countries, I hate to put it this way, but the United States and the USSR see these countries who used to be colonies of especially Great Britain, but also France, they see them as like up for grabs. So here's what we've got. These colonized people in Asia and Africa start to gain independence quickly. So interesting fact here, from 1957 to 1962, 25 new states were formed. These new states, these new nations that were formed after decolonization, they're called the Third World. Another term is the Global South. And this is kind of a scary fact as well, that while the Cold War didn't end up resulting in any actual fighting between the United States and the USSR, all the fighting that did occur was in places like Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The Cold War caused a lot of destabilization in those countries, and that destabilization and the impacts of that last to this day. So this is a little bit of a confusing aspect of World War II and the Cold War. We have China now that we're going to talk about. During World War II, China was seen as one of the allies of the United States and Britain because China helped resist the Japanese. So what's happening in China pre-World War II is civil war, a really vicious, difficult civil war. And that's being led by Chiang Kai-shek against the communists who are led by Mao Zedong. So they take a pause in fighting to help in World War II. And the United States really wants to keep China as an ally because, again, this is a communist nation and it's massive, and we don't want to lose another ally. So what happens here is the United States does not really want Mao to win because that's communism. We'd rather see the nationalists and Chiang Kai-shek win. But there isn't really anything that the United States can do about it. So what happens is the nationalists lose and they leave mainland China and they go to the island of Taiwan. Then in 1949, Mao Zedong, or just sometimes known as Mao, he declares the formation of the People's Republic of China, and he forms an alliance with the Soviet Union. Suddenly, the balance of power in the Cold War and in the world is shifted because here we have the largest nation in the world now under communist control. So once China falls to communism, we start to see other Asian communist movements come through. They're inspired by the Chinese communists, and this is a major humiliation for the United States and especially for Truman. And it causes a lot of angst. Now that the Soviet Union and China are both communist and both aligned, we worry that a lot more nations are going to fall to communism, and for good reason. So here we have the Korean War. We're worried about these nations turning communist, and the first one to, quote, fall is when North Korea invades South Korea. There's a lot of history that leads to the Korean War, and it starts in pre-World War II, or in World War II history here, that what happens is Korea is what's called partitioned, which means split. The Soviets were occupying Korea north of the 38th parallel. American forces occupied Korea south of the 38th parallel. There was really nothing special about that border. That just happens to be where these two nations were occupying Korea to help keep Japan from invading. So in the north, we start seeing sympathies with communism. And so Kim Il-sung sets up the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Soviet backing. In the South, we have Syngman Rhee. He had studied in New Jersey. By the way, Kim Il-sung studied in Moscow. I mean, there's no coincidence here. Syngman Rhee establishes the Republic of Korea, and that's got American support. Important for us to realize that both Syngman Rhee and Il-sung wanted a unified Korea, okay? They also wanted their big superpower allies to help with that. The outcome begins here. The communists move south and they quickly capture the capital of Seoul. South Korea loses a lot of troops very, very fast. Stalin figures that if we surprise invade South Korea, we'll take over. But the United States is not going to just let this go. And what we have is Douglas MacArthur, General MacArthur. And he lands in Incheon in 1950. He's fighting the North Koreans, and he flanks the North Koreans and pins them below their border here. So now we've got South Koreans fighting against North Koreans, and we've got General MacArthur pinning these guys down here. And so then you can have a squish, right? Let's see. MacArthur kind of makes a mistake here. He's pretty boisterous and likes to, he likes things his way, and he criticizes how Truman manages the war. So what happens is MacArthur successfully beats the North Koreans in that squish, but then he decides to keep going, and he wants to continue into North Korea and unite the country from the south and order a surrender. Well, what happens is Mao Zedong has 300,000 Chinese troops come in and drive America out. Plus, the actions of MacArthur were far beyond what Truman told him to do. He kind of forces Truman's hand, and when MacArthur is insubordinating MacArthur, Truman relieves him of his post. Then we have a stalemate in the Korean War. The two nations are fighting one another, bombing one another all the time. Lots of assets are spent on the Korean War, and really not much of a strategic benefit to the United States. During all of this, Stalin dies, and that makes it a little easier to make peace. So they sign an armistice, and that sort of arbitrary parallel partition of Korea at the 38th parallel, that becomes permanent. And then we have a North and South Korea. Important for you to see this part. The war left a humanitarian crisis in Korea. In the United States, the Korean War was very, very unpopular. But unfortunately, the Korean War sets a pattern for future Cold War confrontations, which are essentially proxy battles between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now we start looking at nuclear war. In addition, this is kind of shifting from the Asian impact of the Cold War. So when we have Korea happen, people realize that the United States, if they wanted to, could have dropped the atomic bomb on Korea. And so people start to get really, really nervous. I want you to notice, we're going to back up just a little bit and give you the Manhattan Project. This is what brought the United States to be a nuclear power. The Manhattan Project was top secret, but it was massive. People are in New Mexico and they're in Tennessee. They weaponize uranium and plutonium to create the two bombs, Fat Man and Little Boy, that get dropped on Japan in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. They killed over 100,000 Japanese civilians. We realize that this is pretty dangerous, and Truman doesn't want to be the only person in charge of this. So they create the Atomic Energy Commission. This is civilians, and the Atomic Energy Commission endorsed international control of the atomic weapons. One of the things that is a little bit surprising here, even though we want to control these, at the same time, the United States wants to keep up with Russia, so it keeps building more and more and more. Truman finds out that there's only 13 actual weapons in the nuclear stockpile, and so he says we need to keep going. We need to get a whole lot more. And so over the next 3 years, the United States created more than 200 bombs. And the idea that we want to have more nuclear weapons to stop the Soviets from getting more nuclear weapons is called nuclear deterrence. And what this means is we should theoretically only need to threaten to deploy our massive amount of weapons in order to stop the Soviet Union from using its nuclear weapons. This becomes a problem because really the more you say that you're going to, the more you build up your weapons, the more it causes other people to build up their weapons, right? So it doesn't necessarily succeed. So now we have the Soviet Union getting its own nuclear weapon. So this happens in August of 1949. Here in Korea, this is where this is really important. We threatened to drop the atomic bomb, but it didn't stop China. So we had atomic bombs. We could have dropped them, but China still entered the war anyway. So deterrence obviously is not going to work. Shortly after, we continue developing super bombs. Despite dissent from the scientific community, Truman authorizes building a thermonuclear hydrogen bomb, which is even more powerful than the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 450 times more powerful, by the way. That's pretty terrifying. Now, after Truman, we have Eisenhower. During Eisenhower's administration, the United States builds almost 20,000 nuclear warheads. Even though the United States wanted people to sort of support this continued buildup of our nuclear arsenal, they were drumming up support by scaring us into believing that the USSR was on par with our nuclear arsenal. But in reality, the Soviets lagged behind the United States in almost every metric, including quantities of weapons. All right. Strategies of mutually assured destruction. We start building missiles that can go from one continent to another, so we could destroy from far away. There's a central paradox here that gets a little bit. We alluded to it a little bit ago. Launching a nuclear attack is going to invite an immediate and devastating counterattack. Millions, hundreds of millions of people will die. Entire cities will be destroyed. It is suicidal. People are paranoid. People are frightened. So in the 1960s, we have a new Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. He points this out and he says, we have mutually assured destruction if we do this. I didn't want to highlight all of that. So, Robert McNamara, mutually assured destruction. Any rational application of nuclear war is pointless. You would have to be insane to have nuclear war. There'd be better not to have any war at all. Nuclear proliferation means that nuclear arms are spreading, they are growing in quantity, tense standoffs occur. The Cold War apocalypse that people thought might happen never actually happened, thank God, but it fueled conflicts around the world. So, new leadership. We go from Truman to Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a World War II veteran. His vice president is Richard Nixon. We also have